As we discussed in class on Tuesday, there are a variety of objections to classical utilitarianism. Most of the ones we discussed were related to practical constraints, like being able to measure value or being able to know the consequences of our actions. But there are also a series of theoretical objections to utilitarianism, and these are the objections that tend to motivate the shifts and the developments in contemporary consequentialism in response to these objections. So the first set of theoretical objections are deontological constraints on our action. So the kinds of deontological constraints that we might think of are respect for persons. So people are fundamentally deserving of respect. And if we violate that basic respect for them, then we are doing a wrong. We can't possibly be doing the best or the right action. And if that's the case, then there are a number of instances where utilitarianism will lead us astray, namely because we might produce the best overall consequences, but nonetheless be violating a really important constraint that is deeply valuable to society, such as the respect for persons. Another set of constraints are rights. So these tend to be seen as stemming from our respect for persons, but they're the sorts of things that we expect that people should be granted and that should be protected no matter what. And if we're carrying out sets of actions that take away those rights for the sake of achieving the overall best consequences, then we're disrespecting the very notion of rights itself, namely things that should not be taken away from people no matter what. So let's look at some cases that were presented in the text. So the first is one of punishment and retributive justice, where one might frame the innocent to quell an angry mob. And there are several problems here, right? For one, we're disrespecting the person who gets framed. It's hard to think of a more disrespectful sort of experience that one could live through than being framed for a horrendous crime that one has not committed. And it also violates the rights, for example, the political rights to due process and to a trial before a jury of one's peers. So it's problematic in that way. And in terms of retributive justice, it also seems to violate what we think is important about punishment, namely that someone deserves the punishment that they receive. That's the basic justification for punishment itself, is that whoever is being punished deserves what they get. And if someone has in fact committed no crime, not only do they not deserve what they get, but they're also being subjected to an egregious wrong on top of that. So that's a case where it seems that the utilitarian has rendered an incorrect moral verdict by failing to consider respect for persons and rights. Another case is one that I alluded to on Tuesday, which is the medical sacrifice, which we would think violates someone's right to life. You can't just murder someone to take their organs to give to other people who, because there are more of them, will technically produce a greater amount of good than the person who was killed in order to have their organs harvested. So finally, there's the issue of distributive justice. Namely, we might favor the aggregate utility, right? The aggregate good consequences over treating everyone fairly. So if some people in the class will all get an extra 10 points on their grade, no matter what. And that's going to make them all really happy. And the rest of the people in the class don't know about it. So it's not going to make them that sad. I'll still grade them using the regular grading scale, the grades that they would, by all accounts, deserve. And those other people just get a little extra. It seems like people would object strongly to that on the grounds that it's unfair. You guys have rights as students to be graded and treated equally and fairly, and it doesn't respect really any of you, because the people who get the extra points are not being evaluated based on their actual capabilities, and the people who don't get the extra points are being graded in some way more harshly in comparison than they would deserve to be graded. And so it's unfair. It's unfair to favor the overall utility over just treating everyone equally, all things considered. And so these are the types of deontological constraints on actions that, as we will see, motivate rule utilitarianism as a possible modification to the act utilitarianism that's typically associated with classical utilitarian doctrine. Another set of constraints is, or of problems for classical utilitarianism, is problems associated with demandingness. And again, we talked a decent amount about these when we were considering impartiality. So the first type of demandingness objection is the supererogation objection. So when we were talking in class, it came up that someone might go above and beyond. They might sacrifice themselves in some way for the sake of others. For example, by rushing into a burning house to save children. They might become injured or possibly even die. And we would still evaluate that action as good. Now, the problem is that in classical utilitarianism, because it's a maximizing theory, it says we have to always do the outcome that would have the greatest benefits. And if that's true, that means that there seems to be no end to what might be required of us. And that means there is no such thing as supererogation in that case. There's no going above and beyond the call of duty. We just always have to do the thing that produces the best outcome. And so most people seem to intuitively reject that. It seems like there should be some limit to what constitutes our duty, and we should have an option about whether or not to go further than that. And so that's the motivation of the supererogation or demandingness objection. Another way in which consequentialism, or rather classical utilitarianism, can be seen as excessively demanding is in relation to our special obligations. To assume that people will not have any weighting that they do, say, of people who they care about, or that they have special relationships to, that we shouldn't prefer those people over others. So special relationships are things like parent relationships, right? As a parent, it would be required of me to, in some cases, favor my child over other people's children, because it happens to be my job to make sure my children are raised well and have the things that they need. Or as a lawyer, say, it's your job to defend your client, to advocate for their interests. You shouldn't advocate for someone else's client's interests, especially if they're in opposition, say, to your client's interests. So it's not just, even if doing so would produce the best outcome overall, because you're that person's lawyer, and you have to advocate for the interests of your own client, not just somebody else's. And so there are many sorts of role relationships we can think that we might have to people that would constitute special relationships, where we would need to weigh the well-being of that person over the well-being of others. And so in that case, people tend to think that consequential or classical utilitarianism is excessively demanding, in that it demands that we ignore the role that our special relationships may have in our decision-making process. And so given these objections based on demandingness and based on deontological constraints, there are a range of responses that contemporary consequentialists have come up with, in which they modify the theory of classical utilitarianism to account for the very genuine motivation of the concerns that we've discussed here. And we'll go ahead and discuss those in the next section of this video.